So the key to good soldering is good preparation, and there's a very specific process that you should follow when you're soldering in order to get excellent soldering joints. So after you've cut your length of wire, I use these automatic wire strippers, but you can just use any way. But you want to strip about, I don't know what that is in imperial, but maybe about 1 centimeter worth of wire, and then immediately twist it up. Just pinch it with your fingers and twist, and that'll keep all of the strands together. You want to take your soldering iron, you want to melt a small piece of solder onto the iron, place it against the wire, allowing the wire to get hot, and then just melt the solder in from the opposite side. You're melting the solder onto the wire, not onto the iron. And this is called tinning, that when you go to actually join the wire to the wire or the wire to the switch, you're not trying to hold 10 things at once. You're just melting the solder back together. So the next step when you go to the switch is you want to tin the terminal. So just place the iron nice and flat, melt some on, and then you should just be able to feed in a nice big puddle of wire. When you want to join the wires, you just grab the two things, pop it on, and then just let the solder melt back together.
Look at that.
Getting a nice, perfect soldering joint. And can you see how the solder surface is nice and smooth and shiny? That means you've got a good join. If, let me just do it badly, if you are moving the join back and forward, that actually still worked. Yeah, if the joint is moving, you can see the surface is sort of like scaly and rough. That means that it's a bad solder joint. And that'll also happen if the solder is not hot enough. Now this iron is plenty hot enough, so you won't really see a cold solder joint, but if the surface of the solder is nice and smooth...
A proper blob.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're soldering two things together, it's a little bit nerve-wracking because if you apply too much heat for too long, you'll melt the original solder holding the wire on. But if you just go slowly, carefully, you'll get to a point where you've completely melted the solder of your second wire around the first wire. That is how you solder properly. Patience, waiting to tin everything fully and completely, so when you look at the wire, all you see is solder. It's nice and smoothly connected on. It doesn't look like it's blobbed on. It's actually melted in. I've seen far too many people, when they go to tin their wire, to just not tin it enough and not let the wire get hot. What will happen is when the wires heat up, the surface tension of the solder will actually pull and sort of soak into the wires in exactly the same capillary action as a towel soaking up water.
Or a tree.
Or a tree lifting water from the roots. As you can see, the solder is sucked all the way up into the wire, and in fact, if you try and bend it, you'll find it'll come up to about that far inside the actual insulation. And we've also left a nice large blob of solder on the end that will be easily melted onto whatever we're soldering it to.
That's not going to melt the silicon, will it?
No, well the silicon, I believe the silicon is rated at, no, this is 180 degrees C rated silicon wire, but I believe that rating is to hold that for a minute? I'm honestly not sure, but the temperature of the solder is hot, sure, and you might get some discoloration, but it's not going to ruin it.
So tiny.
Okay, so when you're tinning the terminals for motors, you have to have a little bit of care not to completely blob the solder around, but at the base of the terminals there is an insulating plastic piece. So if you do put a lot of solder on, it's fine as long as you only do it once, because even if you're connected to the casing with one wire, it doesn't matter. Just patience, heat, slow, good soldering.
Practice.
There's also a lot of practice in it.
And a good soldering iron.
And a good soldering
I
iron.
might put in the description a recommendation for one.
This is a 45 watt station. It's temperature controllable. I've set this at 350 degrees C, which for lead solder, which is what I'm using, and I highly, highly, highly recommend using lead solder because that temperature for its melting point is much lower. Very high temperature iron and a low temperature solder, my solder joins flow and melt almost instantly. Whereas if you're using one of the ones that plugs straight into the wall, it's going to be a lower wattage, it's not going to get as hot, it's not going to be as well temperature controlled, and if you're using lead-free solder, then it won't melt and flow as well. That is Ryan's Soldering 101. Lead solder, hot iron, patience, tin everything. I'm Ryan from Make.Test.Battle, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make an auto strife. Right?